This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I wonder if New Yorkers have had more or less trouble voting as those in other states on Election Day. I just can't tell, but there is no better person to ask than my guest, Doug Kellner, the longtime outspoken advocate for election reform and co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections. So, did we have as bad a time? I don't think so. I didn't want to preempt you, but anyway.
No, I think the City Board of Elections did a fairly good job, especially under the adverse circumstances of Superstorm Sandy, where they really did step up to the plate and worked out the logistics under very difficult circumstances.
That's what's so interesting is they didn't have much notice, and they took this complicated thing and they were able to do it. But with the regular elections that they know they're going to have every year or whatever, they leave much to be desired. They need to be challenged, right?
I agree. And I think that there's a lot more that can be done, especially to reduce the lines in the presidential election year. We forget, 4 years ago, the lines were even longer than they were this time. And there are steps that could have been done to speed the lines more. But overall, I would still say the City Board did a good job.
But the board told the New York City to do something else that they haven't done, right?
The
State Board.
The state has a regulation now that requires that the local boards of elections set up their staffing so that people don't have to wait in line more than half an hour. And the city obviously did not comply with that.
How do they do that? They can add more people, you mean?
They have to add more people, more space, and work out the logistics. It really is just mathematics when you get down to it. How long does it take a voter to sign the registration book, which is the bottleneck that we have right now. But I would add that that's better than 4 years ago where we had the lever machines, because the system for signing the registration books is the same. But 4 years ago, after you signed the registration book, you still had to wait in line to use the lever voting machine. And now, with the paper ballot system, there's really no waiting after you sign the registration book. You fill out the ballot and put it in the scanning machine.
Do you like the new system? Are you pleased with it?
I think it's much better than what we had. There are critics out there, but if you think about it, the lever voting machines did not leave an audit trail. You could never be sure that the lever actually advanced and counted, and we know that there were cases where the levers would stop working. The voters and the election workers would never know that the machine wasn't counting every vote. And now with a paper audit trail, you can always go back to the paper to make sure that
Do you get a total? I mean, does each machine gives you a total?
Yes.
It's all total?
Yes.
So it's not like the lever machines when you had to open the back and an inspector would call off the numbers?
Well, it's different. At the end of the day, the election workers have the machine print out the results. And of course, that's one of the issues that's going on now, because New York City is the only place in the state that after the machine prints out the reports, New York City then cuts them up and sorts them by election district and then manually adds the result on the canvas sheets.
Well, that's crazy.
And we've been saying that they should just staple the results tapes to the canvas sheets and send them in without doing all
how many counties are there in the state?
There's 62 counties in the state.
And how many of them have the same kind of machine we have?
There are 5 other jurisdictions that use the exact same machine, but everybody uses ballot scanning. So it's the same system, but The other 52 counties use a Dominion voting machine that's similar, but it's a different
So
manufacturer.
there's a question that hangs over us all the time. If I can buy something and charge it on the internet, why can't I vote on the internet?
A lot of people ask that question, and the bottom line is that the internet is still not 100% secure. And the big difference with financial transactions is that you're moving money. If somebody games the system and figures out how to hack into the system, the money is missing. And you can go back and trace what happened. You don't always catch the bad guys, however. And the problem with doing that online, with voting, is that because it's insecure, you could never be, and you have a secret ballot, you could never trace back to make sure that votes aren't being stolen or through some hacking system.
And another way you can see it is if you get your credit card and you're charged for something you didn't get. That's the
Right.
double check. Either you don't get the money or you don't.
Right. The financial industry loses hundreds of billions of dollars a year in fraudulent transactions, but they regard it as a cost of doing business. They still make more money using that than
Isn't that something?
otherwise. But
Has anybody ever totaled up the wasted, value of wasted or stolen? I don't know if you want to say it's all stolen, but it's the same thing as a department store with
Right.
shoplifting or losing merchandise.
right,
Or restaurants.
it's a huge, huge number.
Yeah.
But as I say, the financial industry is willing to bear that cost because in the end they still come out ahead. In voting, we can't do that, and we wouldn't have a way of even knowing that the machines were hacked and that votes were being stolen. So that's why
Can't do
internet
it.
voting is a bad idea.
So is voting by mail? Well, let's go. The machines you think are working well and that we have the double checking ability.
Yes.
So the machines are no longer really the item that needs to be looked at. I mean, we went through a long time with corruption and different things and all that kind of stuff. But the registration and the voting process are things that can be improved.
That's right. Well, one of the things that I and many people advocate is that we have same-day voter registration, that there ought to be a presumption that everyone is entitled to vote, and the only exceptions are if you're not a citizen or if you've been convicted of a crime and lost your right to vote for
So
that.
in New York State,
And-
if you're convicted of any kind of a crime, felony?
The rules in New York State are that if you're if you are convicted of a felony, that's where you're sentenced to a year or more, and you're not entitled to vote until your felony sentence has been fulfilled.
so you
So
finish
even if you're
parole.
out on parole, you're not entitled to vote.
but you can always be counted in a census,
Yes,
which we could talk about because it all goes round in circles, right?
right.
So let's go back, same day, right?
Right, so you have same-day registration would be a good idea. It's feasible because you would have people who are not in the registration books vote by affidavit ballot, so they could still be checked after the election to determine that they were actually eligible.
But it requires more personnel? Is that what the problem is?
It requires an amendment to the state constitution. That's the biggest problem. Right now, the state constitution says that you have to register 10 days in advance of the election. And not everyone supports the idea
Because, well, it gets
because
all...
it would get more people voting.
The right to vote is guaranteed in the Constitution?
Yes,
In the state
in the state constitution, but
Not
not
in
in
the
the federal.
Yeah,
right.
isn't that interesting? It's such a kind of thing. So early voting also would be controlled by the state?
There's no reason why we couldn't have early voting in New York if you vote in person at the Board of Elections. So that's certainly an idea worth pursuing. Vote by mail is a different proposition. Now, especially in the West, the majority of people are voting by mail.
Yeah.
And in some places, they don't even have local polling sites on Election Day. Oregon, 100% is vote by mail. In California now, It's well over 50%, and there are a number of rural places in California that don't even have polls on election day. The problem with vote by mail is that historically in New York, that has been the single biggest area where there has been election fraud, because you don't have the voters showing up in person. So the cases of fraud that we have experienced over the last 2 decades have almost all been vote by mail schemes, especially in smaller elections where it's easier to...
Local elections where we have a little bit more opportunity to steal an election, right?
Right, right.
But the fraud most likely doesn't come from individuals, it comes from political people.
That's right.
Which is
at least what we've
the great tradition of New York
covered.
State. It's terrible. But if we voted by absentee ballot, what do you have to say to get an absentee ballot?
Well, right now in New York, and this is required by the Constitution, absentee ballots are permitted for people who can't go to the polls because of a physical illness or physical disability, and for people who are going to be outside the county on election day.
If you asked for an absentee ballot and you really didn't need it, what happens?
Well, if you said that you were going to be absent from the county and it turns out that you were there on election day, you're supposed to go to the polls and vote in person.
And otherwise you're in real trouble.
Well, if you're committing election fraud by falsely claiming that you're going to be out of town.
Right. But that hasn't been seen as a great opportunity for people so far.
No. The experience is that New Yorkers have not misused that.
That's good. One of the few things, maybe. I don't know. I know that, you know, you're co-chair of the state board. I have 2 questions about that. The difference between a county board of elections and the state board of elections.
The county boards of elections, and in New York City, the city board of elections, are responsible for actually running the elections. The state board does statewide functions. We're in charge of the campaign finance disclosure system, and we receive the totals of votes from the counties and add them up for statewide offices.
So you're co-chair because voting is a very political thing, right?
It is.
Yeah. And there's supposed to be equal number of Republicans and Democrats at every table when you're locally voting, but on the Board of Elections, at the State Board of Elections, and even to be co-chair?
That's correct. The New York State Constitution, in a major reform in 1894, required that there be equal representation from the 2 largest parties at every level of election administration.
So before that, it was just the Democrats?
Well, it was whoever controlled the local machinery.
Yeah. Did the Democrats win control of the state Senate?
We believe so, although the final vote has not been certified. There's still 2 contests where the absentee ballots will make a difference.
Are you satisfied the way the boards are put together?
I think that it's not a great system, but there's nothing better than that system, because there's really no such thing as nonpartisan election administration. In a lot of other states, it's the elected Secretary of State who controls the election machinery, and you can get good elected secretaries, or you can get very partisan secretaries. So it really comes down to the individuals who run it.
And we don't elect Secretary of State here anyway, do we?
No, that's right.
Yeah. So it's always going to be partisan. It has great ramifications if you start tracing it, right? Doesn't it?
I'm not sure where you're going with it. But
well, I don't know. As I told you, I've just I mean, we've been so immersed in stories about registration and voting procedures in other states. It's been interesting. Is there any state that does it much better than we do it?
There's no state that's comparable to New York, but yes, there are states that are better, and there are states that are much worse. The key thing is, I think it's good in New York that the parties have to work together. One of the things that I note is that, unlike a lot of other states, the New York Republicans did not get on the national agenda of trying to suppress the vote by requiring additional voter identification or doing things that would make it more difficult to vote. And so to that extent, we're blessed that the bipartisan election administration system is basically working in New York.
What state do you think is the best in the country?
Right now, I would point to Minnesota, which does have an elected Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, who does an excellent professional job. But there, the Republicans in Minnesota have just required additional voter identification that maybe will set them back on that scale.
So the Republicans in the state, though, haven't been nonpartisan all the way down the line.
No, there are always little issues that.
But there are
that we
also
have
major
disputes
issues
about.
such as redistricting. And it struck me in
Yes.
this, I don't know why I never realized it, but it struck me that the last elections, the 8 of a decade, you know, whatever year it's 2008 or 2018, whatever year is 2 years before the next decade starts, is a very important election, right?
Absolutely, and redistricting has really worked out to the detriment of the Democrats, both nationwide and in New York. Nationally, Democratic candidates for Congress received more votes than Republican candidates for Congress, if you add up all the votes across the nation. And yet the Republicans are going to have roughly 30 more members of the House of Representatives than the Democrats do. And in New York, historically, roughly 60% of the vote for the state Senate has been Democratic. And yet the Republicans have almost always controlled the state Senate. Now, that may change this year as it did 4 years ago, but
then it could change in another 2 years.
that's right.
So what we're saying is that that election is so important because then the majority party is in control of the congressional redistricting in each state.
That's right.
And we see what happened 2 years ago. That's when it was a landslide with all these conservative Republicans, and they then redistricted. And that accounted for a lot of the confusion and the problems.
That's correct. What the Republicans did in those states where they controlled the reapportionment process, they compact districts where they try to put as many Democrats as possible in the same district, and then create other districts that are just a small amount of Republicans, but enough to guarantee that a Republican will win.
And then they pass all this legislation about IDs and
That's right.
voter registration and stuff. So we have to somehow notify the electorate that they got to pay attention in that 8-year election.
That's right. And in New York, you know, I mentioned that the Republicans have not been retrogressive in trying to get additional voter identification, but it has been the Republicans who have blocked reforms like same-day voter registration and making it easier to get absentee ballots.
So their premise is keep people away from the polls, we'll do better.
Yes, but
To put it bluntly.
But as I say, they've not been as bad in New York as in many other states.
I don't understand what happened in California. Can you explain that? How they changed the rules so they have...
Of the top two.
Yes.
Yes. So in California, everybody runs in the same primary election. And the two candidates who receive the most votes run against each other in the general election. And so the result is that in a fair number of districts, you had 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans getting the most votes in the primary election and then having to run against each other in the general election. It's interesting. It certainly has had an adverse effect on the smaller parties because they don't even get to be on the ballot in the general election.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it may have an effect of moderating the political parties because you don't have the extreme elements of either the Republicans or the Democrats winning the primary and then forcing the voters to choose a relatively undesirable candidate from their own party, so that moderates tended to do better than the extremists.
But in districts that are predominantly either Democrat or Republican, you can predict then usually, can't you, or not? I guess you can.
Well, yes, but as I say,
Maybe not.
The Tea Party Republicans had much less success under
Right.
this top two system than they did before.
I was just surprised that Howard Berman, was his name, right? Howard?
Yes.
Yeah, that he lost. I mean, he's been in the Congress for so long and
Well,
had to run against another Democrat. It's
yes.
interesting. So it's in a way a self kind of thing within the Democratic Party also, or the Republican Party.
That's right.
You know, it's interesting. We would never have that here. I don't think I would really.
Well, you know, Mayor Bloomberg had proposed it in a charter reform that lost by a substantial margin, and I think the main concern was that if you had it in New York City, it would mostly be two Democrats running in the general election, and that it would really marginalize not only the small parties like the Conservative Party and the Working Families Party, but even the Republican Party in New York City.
So that was the nonpartisan elections. That's what a
Yes.
nonpartisan election is.
That's well,
Yeah.
they called it nonpartisan, yes.
And the
but,
state legislature is the person who would decide that?
well,
I mean, is the body?
to do it for state elections, yes, it would require a constitutional amendment, but for the city, it was just a charter amendment, and the state legislature is not involved in a charter amendment.
So do you see a different role for the federal government in national elections and even congressional elections?
The federal government can do a lot of things to help make the election process better. For one thing, there are a number of states that really have insecure, inadequate voting systems, and I think it would be appropriate for federal law to require that every state have a system with a voter verifiable paper audit trail, so that we can be sure that votes are being counted the way people intended them when they cast the votes. There are a lot of efficiencies that could come through better federal certification of voting equipment than what we have now, and also reporting problems with voting equipment on the federal level. And then there's the national popular vote issue. I've recently changed my views on this, that I do think that we would be better served by having a national popular vote for president and
not the electoral college.
And not the electoral college. And there are proposals on the table where the states would enter into a compact that would effectively create national popular vote without having to amend the federal Constitution. But if they do that, then Congress really has to step up with better rules to guarantee that everybody's vote counts uniformly throughout the country. And I think that can be done.
They'd never be able to resolve the questions of registration or voting days or things like that? That's always going to be the state?
Well, right now, Congress sets the voting day for president and for...
Just the day?
Yes.
Yeah. So no state could eliminate that day?
No.
But they can add more days?
Yes, before.
There's a case, well, there was very strong legislation a couple of years ago. What do you call it?
The Help America Vote Act in 2002.
HAWA, or whatever it is. Did everybody comply with that?
Yes, basically. I mean, there are a few little isolated issues of making sure that all equipment is fully accessible for the...
So the bill could be amended, basically?
Yes.
To do that. It is a fascinating kind of thing, isn't it? That this is a country, well, I don't know. It's a country that everybody looks to, and yet our elections, it seems to me, are not as smooth as other countries.
Yes, and there's also the issue of proportional representation. You know, it's interesting that after World War II, The U.S. government engaged political scientists and insisted that the defeated countries, particularly Germany and Japan and Italy, put in systems of proportional representation as the best means of preserving democracy in those countries. And a number of countries around the world have copied that system. And yet in the U.S. we still have this system of first past the post, you know, of the person who gets the most votes on election day, without guaranteeing representation to significant parts of the population that don't get enough votes.
How would that affect districts and districting?
Well, you run larger districts. So, for example, you might combine 5 assembly districts and then elect 5 people from that combined area by proportional voting. And so that way, everybody's vote would count. You wouldn't just assume, well, this is a Democratic district or this is a Republican district. That extra vote will make a difference on whether the Democrats get 3 or 4 or all 5 of the seats from that proportional
And that
district.
that would also, there's a case now going to the Supreme Court about the Justice Department overseeing some of the elections because of the lack of, is that because of the lack of participation?
Well,
it goes way back.
No, we're talking about the
related.
Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
One of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act that was adopted in 1965 was that states that historically discriminated in their voting practices are required to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice anytime they change a voting procedure. And I might add that 3 counties in New York were included within that definition, Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. And of course, that was done as payback to Senator Kennedy at the time because they said, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But the issue now is whether the determination that Congress made back in 1965 on states that were historically discriminating still is a fair distinction to make. So the issue really before the Supreme Court will be whether it's constitutional to just continue the same old system of saying that those states that were found to be discriminating in 1965 should still be governed by this very important procedural regime.
We've come to the end, but I want, and we don't have time, but you'll have to come back because I want to know what you're going to be doing in the next 4 years.
Well, I could give you a whole list.
Yes, I should have asked that earlier. But thank you so much, Doug, for coming in. We should have a more positive view about voting. So you have to stand online for a couple of hours.
Well, and it's a community. We didn't get to talk about
Yes.
it, but elections are run in your neighborhood.
Right,
So
so
being
we'll
a
come
poll
back to
worker
this.
makes a difference.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ronnie.
so much, Doug Kellner. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.